This man was called the most dangerous prisoner in the history of American prisons. He spent several decades in solitary confinement, which was absolutely soundproof and where the light was on 24 hours a day. Who is this man and why were they so afraid of him? When 67-year-old inmate Tom Silverstein died in prison at a Colorado hospital several years ago, it marked the end of the longest period of solitary confinement in U.S. history. During his time in captivity, Thomas earned the nickname Terrible Tommy, and for many reasons. The first of which is the life sentence that Silverstein served behind bars, without the right to parole. He spent more than half of his life, namely 35 years, in solitary confinement, with the lights on 24 hours a day. But how did he get there? This story begins in 1971, when Silverstein was first jailed for committing armed robbery. He spent 4 years in California State Prison and was released early. However, very little time passed after this, and Thomas was arrested again. He again committed a series of armed robberies in the company of his father and cousin. This time he was sentenced to 15 years in prison and went to serve his sentence in Kansas. While in prison, he continued to engage in illegal activities. He was part of a group that dealt with the distribution of illegal substances among prisoners. During this activity, he had a conflict with one of his cellmates, after which he died. Thomas was given a new sentence in Silverstein and transferred to a more secure prison. But after not spending a year there, he committed several murders of prisoners who were members of rival prison gangs. It was after these crimes that Silverstein, who by that time was already called the Terrible Tommy, was transferred to solitary confinement. Moreover, this was not a simple solitary cell. There was actually no window in it, only a narrow gap in the wall. The cell was absolutely soundproofed and the light was on there day and night. That is, it was quite difficult to understand how one day replaced the other. Moreover, this room was built specifically for Thomas Silverstein. Food was delivered to him exclusively through a small gap in the door. For entertainment purposes, Thomas was allowed to exercise 1 hour a day in the open air and under guard. There was also the right to make 2 telephone calls per month. After years in solitary confinement, Thomas Silverstein began writing memoirs in which he admitted that being kept in such conditions was gradually turning into torture. As a result, the Terrible Tommy spent more than 30 years in the same cell, and it was only when he needed heart surgery a few years ago that he was outside of the cell for the first time. True, shortly after this operation, Thomas Silverstein died without leaving the prison hospital. However, this is not the only example where a prisoner caused fear and posed an increased danger. I'll tell you about a few more prisoners who are considered the most dangerous in history. Typhoid Mary, aka Mary Malig, has been called the most dangerous woman in American history, and here's how she earned the nickname. Mary immigrated to the United States from Ireland in the late 19th century while still a teenager. She began working early as a maid and cook for a wealthy family. It is unknown where or how, but Mary contracted a bacteria that caused a disease called typhus, and as a result, between 1900 and 1907, Mary managed to work in several houses and became a super spreader of typhoid. Dozens of people became infected from it. And at that moment, this disease was much more dangerous than it is today, and the likelihood of death from it was much higher. When we finally managed to find out who was the source of all the infections, Mary simply disappeared. After some time, she was found in one of the rich New York houses, where she again helped with housework and prepared food. As a result, she was caught and isolated in a special institution. However, after numerous complaints from Mary to the press, the authorities agreed to release her on the condition that she never work in places related to food preparation. Mary agreed and disappeared again. The woman was discovered only several years later in one of the maternity hospitals. There, an unexpected outbreak of typhus occurred among the staff and more than 20 people fell ill. It turned out that the source was an employee named Mary Mallon. By that time, the press was already calling her Typhoid Mary. As a result, Mary was returned back to the isolation facility, from where she was not released for the rest of her life. She spent more than 20 years there. By that time, in the first half of the 20th century, effective vaccines and antibiotics to combat typhoid did not yet exist. Therefore, many super spreaders of this disease were simply kept in prison. However, it was the story of Mary Malone that became the most famous. Due to the large number of people she infected, she became known as the most dangerous woman in America. The name of the American prisoner Jason Barnum would hardly have become known to anyone if not for his appearance. The 39-year-old man not only got a tattoo on half his face, but also on the eyeball itself. For this he was nicknamed the Eyeball Man. Barnum received a 20-year sentence in 2015 for shooting an Alaska police officer. At that moment they tried to detain Barnum on suspicion of theft. The police officer survived, but it is possible that one of the reasons for the rather severe punishment for Barnum was the frightening tattoos. The prosecution insisted that such an appearance indicates potentially dangerous behavior of its owner. When photographs of Barnum hit the press in 2015, it created a real fashion for eyeball tattoos. However, ophthalmologists have an extremely negative attitude towards this idea. Unlike a tattoo on the skin, a tattoo on the eyeball simply cannot be removed, meaning it will remain forever. In addition, this procedure can lead to infection and vision loss. Charles Bronson is considered Britain's most famous prisoner. He received his 7-year sentence for minor theft back in the 70s of the last century, but nevertheless he is still in prison. How did this happen? Charles Bronson was born in the early 50s in the small British town of Luton into a very decent family. His father was even the mayor of this town at one time. By the way, the boy had a completely different name then. He borrowed his pseudonym from a once very famous Hollywood actor. Charles went to prison for armed robbery of a post office. Then he managed to steal only £26, and for this he received 7 years in prison. Charles was only 22 years old at the time. However, he was never released. Bronson became the most famous prisoner in Britain for his very hot temper. Constant clashes with other prisoners and prison guards led to Bronson's prison sentence being extended over and over again. In prison, he constantly caused riots and even took people hostage. Thanks to his behavior and striking appearance, Bronson gained wide popularity. During his time behind bars, he managed to change his name several times, get married and divorced. They even made a feature film about him, where Tom Hardy played the main role. As a result, in 2022 Bronson is 70 years old and is still in prison. Dennis Rader is one of the most famous maniacs in world history. Dennis committed more than a dozen brutal crimes and gained great fame due to the fact that he managed to evade police prosecution for several decades. Dennis Rader committed his first brutal murders back in the 70s. Despite this, he left almost no traces and the police were unable to trace the criminal. As a result, many years later, Rader began sending letters to the police in which he talked about the details of the crimes he had committed. Few could recognize a maniac in Rader, because he was an exemplary family man and at some point in his life even became chairman of the Church Council of the Lutheran Church. As a result, it was thanks to letters sent to the police in the mid-2000s that detectives managed to get on the trail of the criminal. As a result, he was sentenced to 10 life sentences and is currently serving his sentence in El Dorado prison in the United States. Dennis Rader has become the hero of a large number of books, films, and TV series. Ellen Ornish is the most famous female serial killer in U.S. history. In the late 80s and early 90s, she shot and robbed 7 men. Later in court, Ornish claimed that she did this because all the victims initially tried to rape her, and she was forced to defend herself. However, during the trial, the judge did not believe Ornish's argument. Moreover, the fact that the examination revealed severe mental disorders in the woman was not taken into account. She was ultimately sentenced to 6 death sentences. This decision was widely discussed throughout America, as many people believed Ornis's own argument that her crimes were primarily self-defense. However, in 2002, the death sentence was carried out. Ornis became only the second female serial killer in the history of the United States. Just a year after this, a film based on the story of Ellen Ornis was released. The main role was played by Charlize Theron. Thanks to the masterful makeup and acting transformation, the Hollywood star is almost impossible to recognize on the screen. The actress received an Oscar for this role. Peter Kürten. This German maniac was called a real vampire. During his life, he committed many brutal crimes, including almost 10 murders, and several dozen attempted murders, as well as arson, theft, and other violations of the law. At the age of 16, at the very end of the 19th century, he received his first 2-month sentence in prison for theft. After this, there were several more minor crimes for which Itter served minor sentences, but later he made multiple attempts, parts of which, alas, he completed. As a result, he was caught and sentenced to death, and due to the fact that the crime was particularly cruel, after the execution Kürten's brain was donated for research, but according to its results, scientists could not find any abnormalities.